Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This one is from True Parley Grandmaster Foot. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about divisive works, the chaotic nature of art, and a way out of the chaos. Divisive we mean here to mean a work that people significantly disagree on whether it is good, basically. Last time, Mr. Fu Begins, we talked about intentional boredom and how that leads to divisive experiences. I think it was a fine introduction to the topic. Well, I think it was a great introduction to Anyway, it's the previous parlay. You can go check that out if you want. But it's a lot more of a complex problem than that, and the problem extends to almost all art, indeed. And in this one, we're going to talk about what is constructing that confusion. Why do people disagree so much about something some of them think is really, really good? How can it be that there are other people that just think that is devastatingly bad instead? And this is part of Mr. Foot's Invisible Wall series on the frontiers of game design, with a first section called The Chaotic Nature of Getting It. Death Stranding, the example we used heavily in the previous parlay, is one thing. But before that, there was Neon Genesis Evangelion, perhaps the original divisive word. No, not at all. Eva is famous for you either getting it and thus loving it, or you hating it, not understanding what all the fuss is about. I have no interest in discussing the historical relevance of Eva, and I have no interest in debating whether it is good, though we will inadvertently be touching on that subject in this parlay. I want to talk about why the reaction is as divisive as it is, and why some people suddenly feel drawn to rewatching it, which sometimes leads to them changing their mind for no apparent reason. As we talked about in the previous parlay, there obviously is a reason. We live in causal reality. There is a reason why they change their mind. People usually just don't spend 45 minutes on the spot unpacking that, but like, why not? And here we are. I have tried to find those reasons, and these 5-ish sections are what I came up with. Feel free to respond to each section with as much or as little as you have to say. Cool, so pretty simple premise for the parlay. Again, just to clarify before we start, these are 5 reasons why works might be so divisive. 5 explanations for why people can disagree so much about something that some of them think is really, really good. How is it that lots of other people think that same thing that other people think is unusually better than most other things? How is it that some people think that that thing is not just not good, but like actively terrible, like worse than things that the other party thinks are worse? So, something mediocre. And then some people think this piece of media is really, really good, unusually good. But some people think that it's not only not good, but worse than the things that those other people think are like only run of the mill. What's going on there? And here are 5 proposed reasons. Number 1 is liking bad things. Let's get this one out of the way. Yeah, sometimes people embrace their love of bad media for whatever reason. With how many deep emotional responses you get from Eva, or that you can get from Eva, I personally believe that it's silly to argue that it's bad in the way your random isekai is bad. It has to be doing something right to emotionally resonate as much as it does. So without spending too much time on this topic, I do think it's worth unpacking that a little more. I don't think that it has to be doing something right to emotionally resonate as much as it does. People can absolutely have a deep emotionally resonant experience from a piece of media that is not verifiably doing anything right or to prompt that specifically. Obviously, if they have the experience when they consume a piece of media, they read a book or they watch a show or they play a game, and they have a deeply emotional experience, obviously the game or the movie or the book or whatever is what prompted it. I'm just suggesting that that doesn't necessarily mean that that's something verifiably about the piece of media. As we were talking about before, there's this model where there are 2 participants, at least 2 participants, in your experience of a piece of art. There's the piece of art and you, right? You bring some of your own perspectives to it, and a piece of art brings some of its own stuff to the party as well. If you were to go further with this type of media critique, you probably want to start introducing a 3rd element, which is the society around the audience and the art. But for now, we're going to say it's those 2 things. And I think for my model, you pretty much do just need those 2. At the beginning of the parlay, I evoked this idea that I think is important for thinking about media like this, that most people think that their opinion about a piece of art is objectively true. And basically the reason why is that they had the experience they have. And so the one thing they know for sure is that they did have a positive or negative experience, and therefore that's real. It's true. That it must be that. It can't not be. Because even if it seems silly to say they alone magically know that, this thing is good or bad or whatever, well, they know for sure that they had the experience they had. It's interesting. It's kind of like an I think, therefore I am type of argument. But of course, the missing piece here is that their experience definitely was real. They're right, in a way. The one thing we know for sure is that they did have the experience they had. But they only had that experience right now under the conditions in which they experienced the art that time. And there's an additional participant in their experience of the art themselves, I would hope, obviously, when I say it that way. And so to me, the way to begin unpacking the understandable but incomplete way that most people think about art they enjoy or not, and what is, according to me anyway, actually going on, is to begin by introducing the second character in the story, which is the audience. Obviously, there is somebody consuming the media and adding stuff to it. And so what are they adding? We have to say, well, when you say a piece of media is good or bad, what does that mean with a more advanced understanding of the situation where the audience is also a participant? If the audience enjoys something, and we say that it's significantly the stuff brought by the audience to the party, that is why they enjoyed the piece of art, doesn't that just mean that the audience is good and it doesn't really mean anything about the piece of art? Or is the audience then a good artist? Is that meaningful to say? And, well, what I think is that it's more meaningful to say the audience is the one who did something good. It's not bad to enjoy something that we might argue is verifiably bad. It's good that you enjoyed it. It's good about you that you enjoyed it. But it's not a good thing about the piece of media just to say lots of people liked it. That means virtually nothing from my perspective, that lots of people like something. That has practically no information in it contained that is about the piece of work on its own. It might, you'd have to look into it, but it often doesn't. Many things that are popular, essentially 0% of the merit is actually from the piece of work specifically. Again, obviously the people who had a good experience with it had the positive experience while experiencing it. We can take them at their word for that anyway. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can reliably attribute that good experience to the piece of work. And therefore, a good piece of work can only be meaningfully evaluated in this context as one where the piece of work itself is where we can trace back the source of the positive experience. Usually, to simplify as much as possible, this will be specific works. Because even a general work, were it the only one of its kind, can be the only way you would experience a certain feeling. So even if the audience has a good experience, and the good experience is from the audience, it was brought about by this work, so unless there are lots of other works like that, there's no other way for the audience to bring out that experience they had except with that piece of work. Just as an example, if there were no simple relaxing activities except golf, then we have to attribute the relaxation to golf. We simply have no choice but to say that golf is a really good game. If, even though you don't specifically need it to be golf, to have that relaxing experience, you could just not, sorry, people who like golf, but go for a walk. You could just go for a hike. If you magically hiking is impossible, we banned hiking. If the only way to have that general caliber of experience is golf, then I guess that does mean golf is good, rather than just saying that people are good for enjoying golf. I certainly think that's very impressive. I'm throwing more shade than I actually feel at golf. But you see my point. It's not the only relaxing activity. So it's worth analyzing what the merits of golf are. What's specifically good about golf, or Mario Party, or Cards Against Humanity, or all of these things. And it's not that they don't cause a lot of people to have positive experiences, but many other things seem to meet the very low criteria required to evoke those positive experiences. Therefore, I think it is useful to think of it as being that the recommendation here is to hang out with friends, not play Cards Against Humanity. Not because it doesn't cause those experiences, but because many other things would also cause those experiences. Whereas I don't think that as many things will give you the experiences that Neon Genesis Evangelion gave you. It's more particular or specific. almost always this is going to come at the cost of perspective needed from the audience to be able to enjoy what is inside of it. And you're going to see that as we go on. But I think this is a critical point because, again, Mr. Fruit, you say, it has to be doing something right to emotionally resonate as much as it does. According to me, no, it doesn't. It could be that many people have something resonate with them a lot, and they have decided to point the finger at that specific piece of work, but upon analysis, no, if we could reorganize things and just had them read something else that basically fit the bill, they would also have had a similar experience from that. The fact that they say it's because of this book means nothing. They're probably just wrong. How are they supposed to know? And when we analyze the situation, it can become clear whether there are specific things about that work that cause those experiences, or if they were just kind of looking to have that kind of experience, and it happened to be brought out by this, but many other things would fit the bill for bringing that feeling out. And yes, I think this is a place where we can see people don't really draw this distinction, but in fact, there are roughly two kinds of work here. Works about which we disagree because some people think they're boring and generic, but other people like because that was the generic thing that brought out certain feelings they had, where the people who like it are wrong only in the sense that it isn't specific to that piece of work that they had that good experience. They did have that good experience. You can do it with this work, but that doesn't necessarily mean the work should be credited with quality as a result of that. And works where a lot of people like it and a lot of people dislike it because they don't get it, they say, where here we can attribute the quality from the people that like it to the work. Here you could say the people who don't like it are wrong only in the sense that there are qualities that are positive that come mappably from the work. There's still a lot of work the audience has to do. They have to come prepared to enjoy those things. We'll get into that as we keep going. But you could say verifiably that there are, like, general things are sort of bad only in that they lack that specificity, and more specific things, if they achieve their goals well, their specific goals, are good in some verifiable way. But both of those things are only true in the context of the audience being there. And even then, it's like, it doesn't matter that much. It mostly matters where you are as the audience, not very much what specific works innately have good qualities. This basically just means as you enjoy things more, you're going to need to find more specific works, and it will start to matter more that the work itself is good, rather just than that the context surrounding the work is good. But besides that, it's largely argumentative. There's not much significance to saying one work is bad or good. They're mostly just stages on which we humans act out our feelings. That's more or less what art is, according to me. Okay, I know that was a long time for let's get this one out of the way, but I think it's a significant point to unpack, and we're actually not completely done. I think it's worth being skeptical that this even happens. Some people embrace their love of bad media for whatever reason. They aren't interested in why that is, but I am, and I don't think that this is them embracing their love of bad media. I think this is they probably just changed their mind, and they don't want to say, like, oh, I was just wrong before, because they don't feel wrong before. They had the experience they had before. So they know for sure it's bad from their perspective. Now, I don't really understand why people aren't so willing to just say, maybe it isn't that simple, but okay, they're not. And so sure, it's ego death, so you feel a little bit less secure about yourself if you know that we basically don't have existing personalities and we can be completely wrong about things we're 100% sure happened to us. But it's not, the negative feeling they had isn't fake, right? It's just like when people have the placebo effect. Their feeling is real. It's only the cause that they created in a previous step. But you can't just say, hey, it's the placebo effect, so stop feeling bad. First of all, you don't know it's the placebo effect. And second of all, no, I mean, their feelings are real. They really didn't like it. That's not fake somehow. They might just be incorrect when they attribute that like or dislike to the specific work. And that could be relevant for recommending things. That's basically the point of this. So we'll get back to this, but I mean, obviously that was the whole parlay right there, but I think that's important for going forward. Okay, section 2, expectations. Gris, G-R-I-S, Gris is one of my, I think it's pronounced that way, is one of my personal favorite games of all time, Mr. Foot. Last year we got its spiritual successor called Neva, N-E-V-A, Neva. Same team, same artist for the original soundtrack, still a beautiful art style, still an overwhelmingly positive reception. I did not enjoy Neva. I could try to explain this with the quality of the game. I could try to explain this with Gree resetting my expectations and this game failing to do so because it does a similar thing and your expectations have already been reset about what games are capable of. But the most simple explanation here is that I had high expectations, and the game had no chance of living up to one of my personal favorite games of all time. Yes, so you can see the model I was describing before, right? You can explain why you did or didn't like it, but what really matters is where are those things coming from? And as Mr. Food is very great example, by the way, has very clearly mapped them. A lot of them are coming from Mr. Food, not necessarily from the game. Now, Gree being appealing to you also seems to have significantly come from the game. And this is not unusual. It's not like some kind of red flag to say, oh, I had a fake enjoyment because it came from the game. No, not at all. Most of all possible enjoyment is going to come mostly from the audience. It's just worth remembering that Gree doesn't then have a replicable appeal. It was kind of a one-time, like a one-off enjoyable thing on your way to a different perspective. And now that you're there, you can't just go back easily. Actually, that would be an interesting parlay. Like, can you? But I don't think you can right now. I would be interested to explore that, but not that I can currently see. So you can't just have that experience again with Neva, right? A great example. With the reputation Ava has as one of the greatest anime of all time, right, it's pretty obvious to see why this is relevant. Something similar could be happening here, where people expect it to be this amazing thing, but when someone says, oh, it's great, and don't explain what they mean by that, people tend to assume there's one objective great, and it must be the one they mean, of course. Very self-centered, but most people think this way. And then when they watch the show, it isn't exactly what they think great is, obviously, and so they don't internalize that. They go, well, this isn't great. Great is these things that I never explained to anyone. And you said it was great, which must mean what I mean by great. And so it wasn't great. What gives? And obviously what happened is that both people set expectations, but they didn't explain the contents of the expectation. There isn't enough of a context or preface to experiencing the piece of work. You could create that context or preface, and sometimes people do this when they review games or discuss games. They explain how it was able to have a big effect on them. And if you were of such a mind, you could use that as a template to try to have the same experience yourself by like timing it right, I guess, in your life. Or you might be able to use their example to explain or figure out whether you have passed that point already or whether you could still enjoy this. That's true of a lot of media. However, Ava is equally famous for being bad and running out of budget. They never ran out of budget. They were forced to rewrite parts of the story, and the story is complex, so that had a lot of effects. We're not going to go into the details here, but yeah, okay. But indeed, Ava is actually pretty notorious for being bad, like in some more objective ways, like the animation quality not existing and it being a slideshow at the very end. This explanation is elegant and it fits parts of the discussion around Death Stranding, but I don't think it's a good explanation for the responses to Ava. Well, at least not on its own. It's obviously some amount a good explanation. This is definitely part of what's happening. Lots of expectations are definitely one of the things that make pieces of work that a lot of people think are really good seem bad to a lot of people. How are they achieving such a low point for some people? Well, part of the reason is that they're being given impossible standards. Sure, that's definitely part of what's happening, but I don't think that's the whole explanation. No. In the first place, did we already talk about the whole thing about things being bad sort of not existing? Right, there's this thing where if the ending of something is bad, in this model where we're looking for what is good or what good is prompted by a piece of media, something being bad kind of means something different than normal. It really just means, does this get in the way of a good thing that the piece of media verifiably does? Or is there a lack of a good thing where there could have been or the audience expected one? And you can see here how badness can be created in abundance just from getting the audience to expect something that is then not there. Not necessarily that anything bad happens, if you think about it. Focus, the next time you feel like something is really bad, on what bad thing is happening. It's almost always the lack of something good. It's a drag, it's boring, it's, not promising the thing you wanted it to have provided or that it promised. The expectations were off. And so you can see how just the game's reputation can be worse than the actual game itself. It could be that you play a game, and if you had no expectations, it's not even really possible for it to be below a certain level of quality because you don't expect anything. It can't fail to deliver as many things. Whereas if I tell you a lot about the game and then you play it and you don't have those experiences, me telling you about the game was in a way a kind of terrible mistake, because now I made it possible for the game to fail at more things. Now the game can be worse than it could possibly have been perceived as being before. And so I think that's another part of the explanation, is that when something has higher standards held to it, or a stronger reputation, it is now capable of being worse than it was before it had that reputation. I assure you that if nobody had ever heard of Neon Genesis Evangelion and everybody watched it, very few people would think it is as bad as huge numbers of people think it is now, because there simply wouldn't be a way for it to fail to provide the good that would lead to that perception of badness for most people. Sure. Again, as someone who doesn't really like this show that much, ultimately, I'm not really trying to argue it's good or bad. That's not meant to be my purpose here. Just to say that I do think it's true that the extent to which a thing is perceived as bad expands that way. If you think about it, how can people even be so heated about something like a TV show or like a game? It just doesn't matter enough in life for somebody to get that upset about it. And one of the explanations is it was made able to be worse by its positive reputation. And there's also other factors that we won't have relevant here, like people feel like it's part of their personality, like stuff like that. Anyway, next one. Changing preferences / maturation of preferences. Pretty self-explanatory. Anecdotally, this also does not apply to how people respond to Eva. Yeah, I mean, it's easy to say, obviously people's changing preferences would lead to them changing their mind about a piece of art they consumed. And so, like, yes, that part's self-explanatory. I think the part that bears much further explanation, though, is that a lot of the time, I believe what is going on is that people need a perspective point to enjoy a given piece of art that is harder to get. Like, not necessarily more advanced, it's not really better necessarily, just that it might take longer or more perspectives to attain a perspective that is sort of an ingredient required for the piece of media to do well. Again, the more that something good is a part of the piece of art itself, often the more it requires specificer materials from the person consuming it. And so it might be that Ava does verifiably do this good thing, but then as a bit of a trade-off, it requires more specific materials from the audience to enjoy. And I do think there are times where that equation can be bucked a little bit, right? I don't think there are only media where the audience doesn't need very specific perspective to enjoy it, but there isn't as much to enjoy. And the audience does need very specific perspective to enjoy it, but there are like more things to enjoy, or more specific, you can't get them elsewhere things to enjoy. Some pieces of media are able to find a way to kind of break parity on this equation. And I do feel like I've seen stories or played games or read books where the relative perspective required to enjoy it is relatively low, but the specific appeal the thing has and how much that is a part of the art itself is relatively high. And that, you would say, is an exceptional piece of work. Not because everybody will agree about it, but because the value proposition for consuming it is unusually strong. It's unusually likely you will get unusually more out of it with relatively little of your own materials. And another thing about that is that if you don't need very particular perspectives to enjoy something, but it provides a very specific experience, it's now got this other benefit where it's appealing to people that are on a more broad level of they don't have any particular experiences. They're newer to a medium, maybe. And people that have a lot of specific experiences, they're therefore able to enjoy all these really specific, really focused works. And so it's harder normally for them to find something that's easy for them to enjoy. But these works that are able to be relatively specific and have their own qualities while requiring relatively little perspective can be enjoyed by both parties, which is very, very rare in my opinion. That people, both who have a ton of experience with something and who are very new to something, both agree this is really good. That's very rare, and you can see why. Usually the things that are more accessible are more broad and therefore commonplace and therefore boring to people that are used to the medium. Things that are more specific might require more specific tools, and so those people who have that perspective are way more into those media, and they're also rarer, they're harder to find, and not as easily enjoyable unless you get into that type of media. So a piece of media that somehow appeals to both groups is very potent indeed. I do think that's possible, and this is a way, if you consider yourself the type of artist that is an entertainer, rather than like your primary reason to do art is to self-express, then one of the primary things you'll be exploring is how do you break parity on that equation? So yes, a self-explanatory point, not an unimportant point, in my opinion. Nice. Emotional state. Yeah, this one is spicy, maybe obvious to some people. Lots of people have theorized or just asserted that Eva is about depression because the protagonist is clearly depressed, and the creator, Hideaki Anno, has said that he was depressed while creating it. And you will never get Eva unless you have experienced depression for yourself. Let's ignore the obvious concerns for now. Death of the author, like it doesn't really matter. You can't really verify. The author can't even know exactly what they were thinking while they made it. So it doesn't somehow make you more right to say, oh, this is what the author was thinking while they made it. That's just something people use to argue that they're right in a reductive way. That doesn't actually do anything or matter at all. Empathy allows you to experience things secondhand. You don't have to literally have an experience to acquire some of the perspective from it, sometimes even more perspective on it than if you experienced it yourself. Obviously, there will be people who are projecting onto Eva or any piece of art they've consumed, etc. There is still some truth to this idea that your emotional state colors your perceptions of art, of course. In particular, there are some states that are more vulnerable or open to emotional experiences. Ooh, not trying to call foul on you myself, Mr. Food, but I do feel this is a somewhat tongue-in-cheek burn, basically that when you are depressed, it is maybe a state where your emotions are more open, and therefore it's easier in a certain meaning of easy for a piece of media to leave a big mark on you in some way. And so people will find it hard if they had a really hard time. I absolutely went through this exact thing myself, so I know exactly this experience. At least this is how it was for me and a lot of other people I knew. You're going through a hard time, you will remember the things that happened during that time. Your amygdala or whatever is popping off in your brain, and you internalize the things that occur in your life very keenly during that emotional, stressful, deeply hurtful time in your life. Your emotions are very raw. Your brain is internalizing things very, very readily. This is how the human brain works. You will remember the things that get you through that time, games, anime, whatever. It is then hard to go back and say, oh, but those specific things, those things that saved my life, were just completely meaningless and don't specifically matter at all, and it could have been any number of things. That might sound callous. I'm sorry, for the purpose of this discussion, though, it does seem to be true, though. I'm not saying that that means they're bad pieces of media. It just doesn't prove they're good. It proves that you're good. By the way, it proves that you persevered and enjoyed this thing and were open to what the world had to offer you. That's wonderful. It is, however, a wonderful thing about you. It does not prove or say much about the specific pieces of art. And yes, if I were to be particularly picky and kind of beat myself up, I'm not trying to be mean to myself and other people who went through this type of experience. I do think that you are probably less of a broadly applicable critic when you're feeling very depressed. I don't think that's the time to say, oh, I'm really sure about these recommendations. You're literally not. And that's fine. It's a time for you. But that doesn't necessarily say that much about those works. Now, that being said, I think my disagreement here is that the experience of depression is not like a unique or specific thing in one sense. Certainly, some people are physiologically, their body makes the depressed hormone depressed in a way that, I'm sure lots of people are not like that. At least it certainly seems like not that many people, but some people have a thing in their body where their body makes the depressed chemical essentially completely unprompted. And that is different and not a thing everyone experiences. But a lot of the thinking that comes up is just true. That's the hard thing about depression. it is depressing being in the world. Sense of loss and entropy and time moving forward and everything being constantly moving and sort of a nauseating roller coaster ride you're locked into. And I could go on, I won't. At least this is a lot of how it was for me. That experience, although it is not the same for everybody, is reminiscent of itself, I think, for, yeah, I think basically everybody. Now, not everybody will experience this, but what I'm saying is that I think everybody is on a path or paths along which there is inevitably essentially depression. And so it's just a thing that you pass through on your way to other perspectives. This is important because it means that depression is not something that selects certain people and not others and determines that only they can enjoy this. It is simply a harder to acquire perspective, or harder is kind of the wrong word. It's a harder to have perspective, harder to pass through perspective. But that absolutely everybody will pass through. And therefore, Mr. Foot, you say, my problem with this emotional state point is that it's not actionable. Is any artistic experience just the game of roulette, where its impact on you is more or less random? Is there some way to curate this? Well, according to me, yes, absolutely. It's not random at all. Almost all perspectives are kind of on a vaguely linear path with each other. They might be in a different order to different people. People progress along those paths in different ways. But depression is not a very optional or unlikely experience for somebody who is consciously thinking about the world around them. It is an obvious feeling to have. I hope I'm not encouraging anyone to be depressed. I'm saying you pass through it. I feel like there's equally obvious reasons to be optimistic about the world around you. Certainly, when I say equal, I mean, I don't know, man, we're just dust in the wind, and so you can turn that coin over and say, well, I can do whatever I want with my dust. That's it. You know, and if you're asking, yeah, I don't have any better way to deal with my depression than that. That's all I got. But I do think it's true that it's not random. And I think this is an amazing line, by the way. Is any artistic experience a game of roulette where its impact on you is more or less random? Well, no. I think that if you can verify when you look at a piece of media, what perspectives do you likely need to have to make it so whatever this piece of media is doing will fire? And you can map those out, and then you could check if you've had them or go have them on purpose in some cases. Now here, I think the unique thing about something like depression is that you wouldn't want to go have that on purpose. And so I think that maybe that's why to some people it feels like, oh, well, it's the chosen people who've had depression that will experience this, and some people are just normies and can't have depression, won't be depressed, and so they can't experience this. But that is wrong according to me. No, absolutely everybody, if they were paying attention, would for some time feel an appreciably similar feeling to this depression we're referring to. It's just that most people will not pay attention for their entire life, and so it will appear as if they just weren't going to be depressed ever, but they would have been if they had really thought about their life. And they would, I think that I have faith that they would probably realize that it's also feasible not to be depressed at some point. I'm pretty optimistic about that. At least I'm trying to be. I'll be honest with you, the moment I said that, my brain went, ha, yeah, right. And it's like, okay, well, screw you. I don't know. I mean, there's no point, right? I might as well be optimistic about it. If I'm wrong, then we'll all die in horrific agony, and there's nothing I can do about that. So. Right. Next point. Meta experience. The experience you have with a piece of art is not the same as the piece of art itself. This is pretty similar to what I've been saying about the audience bringing their own experiences and the piece of media setting up the thing on its own. But you also can't separate the art from your experience with it. Well, you can, but they're both part and parcel of the experience, the art itself, right? They're both important ingredients. Both extremes are silly. Avengers Endgame is not the greatest movie ever made because of how electrifying the cinema audience was. And if you watched Avengers Endgame on a plane ride, you shouldn't be surprised if the movie didn't resonate with you emotionally. I probably don't need to explain this to anyone here, but the experience is like a multiplier or a modifier, nice, on your experience of a given piece of art. Yeah, cool. Maybe some pieces of art are more resistant or more susceptible to these circumstances in which you experience them. Yeah. And maybe Ava is one of them. Okay, that's an interesting point. At that point, the question becomes, what is the best way to experience Ava? Probably by yourself, episodically, in batches, or should you binge it? Big screen or any setup? To me, these answers aren't clear, so this explanation is also unsatisfying. No, but this is still a good point. I mean, in my model, this is explained by this idea that you might need certain perspectives or have passed through certain perspectives to enjoy something, and some of those things might be not what we usually mean by perspective. It might be something like just being a person who adapts to a piece of media to a point. A really complicated thing in media criticism that we really can't unpack here is, to what extent do we say it's important and reasonable, really only a proper review, to try your best to give the piece of media its best chance? And then when do you pass over that line to the point where you're basically just giving the piece of media free credit for something that's something you did? When have you gone far enough that that's really just something about you? It's cool that you made this piece of media into this unique experience, but there's a gray area where you did more than it's fair to credit the piece of media for. Something like that, if you're open-minded enough. You know, when we play an open world game, just because it's open world doesn't mean you can just say, oh, well, you can just skip anything. And it's not a criticism of the game if a piece of the game is bad, because you can just not play it. That doesn't completely work. Obviously, it's kind of complicated. I mean, if enough of the game is that way, you can't just say, oh, if you take this incredibly esoteric specific path through the game, you play all the good content and you skip all the bad content, so that means it's good. It's like, meh. I mean, it's hard to say just no. It's more like, how likely do you feel that path is? And certainly, if the game has level design and cinematic framing, and you get out of the tomb in Breath of Wild or Elden Ring, and you look forward and the game points you forward, there is some meaning to saying, like in Elden Ring, you can just go backwards. You could just go the other way. If you were to do that and had a bad experience, I think it would be fair for people to feel like, well, but you kind of purposefully did something the game doesn't encourage you to do. So that isn't not part of the game. It's not like your criticism is invalid. Why did they let you do that if that can be demonstrated to reliably lead to a bad experience? Which, by the way, I don't think it does. Go backwards when you get out of the tomb in Elden Ring. It's fun. I don't know. That's what I did. I don't think that's bad. This is just an example. But at the same time, that doesn't feel completely fair either. You know, there's a part of you that feels like, well, if you're trying to review the game in a way that's useful, why would you try to have an experience that wouldn't be applicable to most people's experience? Unless you were specifically trying to review, like, pushing the game or doing 100% completion or something. And so, sure, this is complicated. To say what the people who made Game of Thrones said is disgraceful. You know, the episode was too dark, and they said, oh yeah, everybody in the entire universe has the wrong screen except for us. It's like, all right, so your job is to make things for general audiences. So your job is to know what vague type of screen they have, and you have one too. The entire excuse is, that's bullshit, by the way. They're literally just trying to save face. And look, it's fine. You can just say you made a mistake. That's okay. The bad thing isn't the episode not going perfectly. It's challenging to make TV or whatever. The bad thing is, like, pretending that it's our fault for you balancing the colors in a way that doesn't work for, like, any widely applicable screen. Like, that's just a stupid thing to say. And I feel like fairly obviously many people who said that really don't even believe that. That's just obviously a stupid argument. And the reason is that it's asking too much of the audience. I mean, for most people who watch the show, they cannot own a screen that does this thing that the people who produce the show are saying. So it's not really valid to say, oh, it's really good. Like, if you're so rich that you could do absolutely anything and freely manipulate reality around you. It's like, okay, well, obviously that's not to the credit of the show. You can say, great, those producers sure have a fancy TV or whatever, but like, and are good at adjusting color balance, but there is no expectation that everyone in the world would have that. Let's imagine if at the beginning of the episode they said, hey, don't watch this unless you're watching on like an expensive TV or something. Or they gave instructions for adjusting the brightness of your screen. Okay, I mean, I'm not thrilled with that, right? But it's then less fair to say that that's not like part of the piece of media. if there's this cool effect and you need to adjust your screen, all right. I've read a couple of webcomics that will do a thing that it's really cool, where they, at the beginning of the comic, they'll say, please lock your screen, or there's audio that's timed as you scroll through this, so please turn on your phone's volume or wear headphones or something. And then throughout the comic, as you scroll or flip pages or whatever, I'm using this on an app where I, it's a long strip, basically. And you can, pad to go through it or use your mouse wheel or whatever. And sometimes it will rotate. And so you'll turn your phone to landscape position, or like if you're reading it on a computer screen, they'll give you a tool that will let you hit a button to rotate the image. And then it scrolls like this for a little bit. Or the audio will kick in at a certain point once you pass a certain mark in the comic strip. And that's really cool. And I think it's fair to credit those comics that way because they tell you exactly what you need to do. It works on all devices that are applicable, and it's easy to do. Those three key things. It requires essentially no experience, negative experience. And it has a nice benefit, and it uses the form in this interesting way. It's kind of like something everybody could always have been doing, but just not everyone uses. Using a new function of a device is not the problem. Saying use your brightness settings isn't the problem. The problem is they didn't say to do that. And then they retroactively said, oh, but if you just did it the way we did it, then it would be fine. That's obviously something about them, not something about the piece of media. Screw the people who said that about Game of Thrones. Sorry, that's extremely immature. I cannot believe that people of that level of skill making the rest of the show actually said that. That's insane. What a delusional thing to say. Anyway, I think this is one of those cases where if you enjoyed watching Ava under your covers on your Steam Deck, that's very interesting. I'm not sure it's entirely fair to say that if the show gained benefits from that, that is a benefit of the show. That's like, well, this other thing. And I do think that a lot of people saying, for example, I feel like where this is going with Ava is, oh, it's really beautiful animation, so if you watch it on a big screen, you'll appreciate that more. Well, but only if you already have the perspective where you would appreciate the animation. I don't feel like that is likely to make a significant difference to the people for whom it would matter. Or if you're somebody who will enjoy that, you don't need to be invited to do that. You would already either think to do that, or it won't matter if you don't. I'm quite skeptical of that mattering at all, basically. The real answer, Mr. Fu concludes, as to why the response to Ava is chaotic and unpredictable, is boring, because it's some mixture of all of the above, along with a smart-sounding and impossible-to-disprove argument that it already affected you the first time around, and you just didn't want to notice. But all of this makes me wonder if we can control this chaos in some way. And of course, I'm here to tell you that you totally can. You absolutely can. There are, for example, ways to diagnose, as I've tried to vaguely demonstrate. I know it's not the most direct demonstration. This parlay is very long, so we don't really have time for that. But we have talked about, you can pair apart. Is the appeal that what people say they like about it, is that coming from the piece of media specifically? Or would that kind of happen with anything of this general quality with vaguely these qualities? And people just really want that thing, or people are adding a lot from themselves. A really interesting example that comes to mind is A Court of Thorns and Roses. This is a really popular romantasy series, and everybody that I've spoken to who liked this book, I'm very interested in romance fantasy as a genre. I'm kind of happy that people want to take a look at that, but I read that book, and I think it's very bad, where remember bad here means the lack of good things where they could have been there, or things that get in the way of a thing that could have been good. I think that this is bad in that first way, mostly. There very little happens, and it easily could be interesting, but it just usually nothing happens instead. And it's not like your book doesn't have to be plot driven. People are often overly critical of that. It's not like that. I usually actually prefer those stories, but this isn't like that. It's not character driven, really. Well, I guess it is, for lack of anything else. I don't know. That's hard to pair apart because it's not about anything, really. Very little at all happens. I mean, to be fair to her, I guess it's not very long. It's not that long of a book, but very, very little happens. I've read equally word count works that a lot more happened in, a lot more character development, or just interesting conversations, or world building, or not necessarily plot, is what I'm saying. Just more of everything, every possible thing. The words did more per word than this did. And it's interesting. Every person I've talked to about this book so far has said, I would have enjoyed more romantasy. And it's like, okay, so you say you like it, but at the same time, the one thing it was meant to do, the one thing you would have liked more is if it had more of that. Like, and it didn't have enough of that. It sounds like you really want this thing. This is one that everyone is talking about. It's not really about anything or does anything. So nobody can really reject it or object to it easily. And therefore you will be exposed to it and experience it and like it because you really want that. But it doesn't actually do any of the things that you want it to do or anything else. Frankly, sorry. It's not, and in a way it's like, so I guess it's not a bad book. Like if you had never read any fantasy before, like I feel like you can probably jump ahead a little bit past this. And I would have such suggestions, but I mean, it's fine. You know, you won't be overwhelmed. I just think you might be a bit bored, or at the end, you won't have thought you were bored, but you'll go, well, but I kind of want more of what this was pointing toward. And it's like, right. So you just to start there, I think, but I don't know. I've lost that perspective. It's been a long time since I went through that perspective. So I don't know. Maybe that's wrong. I just think that's interesting. You can map out what kinds of things you'd want from a series like that, and then say, okay, well, what is doing more of that? And then what happens when you do more of that? So let's talk about romance, for example. What happens when you give the romantasy people who liked this book, wanted to like this book, more romance? Well, this is like a slightly spicy kind of romance book. There's a little bit of sex in the book, is what I'm saying. There would probably be more and more emotional and therefore particular sex in the book. And that would make it more vulnerable sex in the book. And you can very quickly start to imagine that now, for the audience to be okay enjoying that, you might even go so far as to say to effectively establish consent, the audience needs to have passed through more experiences. And what you've done, just like that, we have now lowered the amount of people who will enjoy it. We've risen the barrier to entry for this work. By making it better, we increase the barrier to entry. And that's not always necessary, but it is very often the natural result. There might be ways to break parity on that, but a lot of the time there aren't. And I think romance and sexy stuff in books is a very classic example, maybe the example, of it's quite difficult to get both at the same time. Like it's quite hard to make a book have more of that without increasing the barrier to entry in some way, which is why everybody seems to prefer the ones that don't do enough of what they themselves say they want. That might seem impossible or contradictory. I don't think it is. I think that's why that's happening. And so, yeah, mapping that out more and getting more into this mindset, propagating this way of thinking throughout one's life. I absolutely think that you can get to a point where you understand how to find out what perspectives something wants you to have to enjoy it, and how to get those perspectives, what progression of things to do, when in your life you're looking for that kind of thing, what environment to enjoy something in, etc. It's not bad to include things of your own when you enjoy something, just you can also be enjoying things that are inherently good in some way, so you might as well do both. And then just enjoy things a lot more. I feel like you can do this. This has been a big project of mine for the past year or so I'm delighted that you asked the parlay about this. Now, there's more to this parlay. This parlay, it was particularly too long to feasibly discuss in any meaningful way without going way over. So what I've done is I've recorded it in 2, and I'm just going to give you that one for free. We have to get parlay to be shorter, and part of it is my fault for not making them like concise, but this one I feel like we were super on task and on target. There's just way too much. This cannot be discussed in one parlay. So I'm going to spot you this one. There will be another one that is the other half of this discussion, which is about basically how we can do this with media from media's end. How do we create a piece of media that is likely to be a favorable contender in the equations that we've set up in this parlay about things being good because of qualities of themselves, stuff like that. Looking forward to it, folks. If you'd like your own parlay like this one, you can do that using a link in the description. We'd love to have you. You can ask whatever you want. Again, I'll try to be very democratic about it if I think something is too long. For now, I'll see you in the next one.